Okay, so let's now play against Blue Prince. Very strong player, so we'll have to be at the top of my game here. So I'll play d4, and after knight f6, let's go ahead and just play some kind of London setup here with bishop to f4. Black goes ahead and goes d6 here, and we can go knight to c3 to go for e4 here and just try and build up a little bit of a center. So he goes g6, and I will go e4, and we're sort of playing more like a Pyrrhic or something like this than a London setup. It's a perfectly reasonable way to play. And I'm going to go for a fast bishop to h6. In general, I think that these systems, these schemes are pretty good against these setups. If black tries to avoid bishop h6 by playing a move like h6 himself, then I can just proceed as normal. And the problem that black faces is that he can never castle kingside, or at least it's an issue because the pawn on h6 will be hanging. So black faces a decision. He goes for c6 here. And here now I cannot remember if you're supposed to play bishop h6 immediately, or if there's some kind of finesse here, like some knight f3 doesn't make a difference. You know, this I have to admit I'm not certain of. So I think if bishop h6, there is some problems with takes, and queen b6 here hitting these 2 points, as far as I recall. So I could just go ahead and castle queenside. Black can launch an attack with a move like b5 here, which I think is very reasonable. But in that case, I might counterattack with e5. And the point is, if he goes b4, I might be able to take here. He could take here, however, hitting my queen. And because it's coming in with check, I don't actually have the time to take here. If my king was on b1, then he could, then I could actually take a second piece. And if he takes my queen, I can take this rook with check, and it would be a disaster. So I think b5 is definitely a possibility here. And after e5, b4, e takes, b takes, queen takes, bishop takes f6. I could consider playing that position. Seems reasonable to me because I don't think his attack is going to be so strong. But on the other hand, my attacking possibilities have also been reduced. But what else to do against b5 here? One other option would be to play a3, but I'm a bit hesitant to play like this because if I go after b5, a3, black can go a5 and use eventually that pawn on a3 as a hook. And that will, in the long run, accelerate his attacking prospects. So while he has a think, I'm debating whether or not I should play, for example, play e5 and go into those complications I just outlined, or whether I should maybe just play a move like f3 and say to him, well, if you go b4, it's not the end of the world for me. I can move my knight, and then I can put my king on b1. It does feel like a little bit too strong of an attack. It's a little bit uncomfortable. So in light of that, there's a part of me that's very tempted to just play e5. But somehow there's something about e5 that's also not convincing me. So I'm not sure. Another option would be to actually say a3 anyway. And if a5, e5, if b4, then takes, and we get this same position. But the difference there is that we've inserted the moves a5 and a3. Does that represent an improvement for me? I'm not sure that it does. So I'm a little bit hesitant to play that way. If f3, b4, I could go knight here. And the point is, if queen a5, sometimes I can even just play a3. I'm going to go ahead and play like that, actually. I feel something's gone slightly wrong in my move order. I know that these setups are definitely objectively quite good for white, but you also have to be very precise in order to preserve your advantage. So I may have mixed up the move order slightly in some way or another. So now I think b4 is coming because what else should black do. That's sort of the point behind b5. And after b4, I have to ask myself where I should put my knight. Definitely one possibility would be, okay, so he's gone there. That move has caught me a little bit by surprise. If I go e5, b4, takes, takes, queen takes, and now he plays queen takes, I might actually just have this little tricky move. So I'm going to go e5 and see what happens there. I think it's, at the very least, an interesting try. If pawn takes, looks pretty good for me. I think what he might do is he might go knight to h5. And then the game gets really sharp and messy if I take this pawn. If he, for example, first takes and then he puts the knight on h5, I feel like he might have to be a little bit careful with with some attacking prospects here along the d file. If his queen wasn't covering the d8 square, it would be mate already. And the other thing that he might have to... So he's gone like this, but does this not win a piece? If I take here, bishop takes here, queen takes, his queen is hanging, his bishop is hanging, he has to take, and then I take here for an intermezzo. So I'm going to go for that. I don't know if there is something else. And actually what I just realized here is I could have even taken here after pawn takes, then bishop takes, would have been an interesting possibility. Although in that variation he would actually take my bishop with check, and after rook takes, then he'd go rook g8. And that position, I think, would be quite good for him. So here, I think in order to not lose material, he needs to go exactly queen f5. So he does, I think he spots the idea just a little bit late, unless maybe he's actually calculated that all of this is quite good for him. But I think my guess is that he spotted the idea, but just a little bit late. And then he decided, whoops, if I take the queen, then after pawn takes, this rook is hanging and my queen is also hanging and I don't have any checks. So he reacts correctly. He spots the fact that my bishop is hanging here. But now I have an interesting idea in g3. The point is, if he took back with the bishop, then I would have bishop h3 and hit this guy, skewering. Unfortunately, after g3, I feel like he can just go ahead and take my piece. So after g3, he can go queen takes f6, and I think that solves his problems. I'm just looking for other ideas, other bishop moves, other knight moves, like knight e2, some queen e3 stuff here. Bishop takes f6 seems to be fine. Bishop takes d6, a desperado move, is definitely interesting here, but after bishop h6 check, then king moves, and then pawn takes d6, it doesn't look so great. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this guy. He will take with check, and I will move my king. He will go rook g8, and now I need a little something here in this position. So one idea definitely that is attractive is to move d5, protecting the pawn and also striking here. It does concede the e5 square, however, so that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Also have to watch out for time, of course. And I'm just trying to figure out, there's also some other ideas like bishop b5 he cannot take because this guy would fall. But after bishop b5, bishop d7, I'm not really seeing anything there. So d5 is looking so far like maybe the best move. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just, for now, trying to hang on to the pawn. I don't believe that I'm going to keep the pawn. But I'm just trying to sort of annoy him as much as possible. And maybe force a slight concession, for example, queen f6, queen takes, and pawn takes. His structure would be completely shattered. So we've got 7 pawns for him and 8 for me, which means that I'm kind of free rolling on this pawn on g7. And my development is a little bit better as well, I think. So overall, my position should be quite good here. But the question is how to really take advantage of it. Knight h3 is an interesting try here. The idea being that I welcome an exchange, a damaging of my pawn structure. But one of the nice things about accepting my damaged structure is that my bishop then would really, my light square bishop would sort of roam free along the light squares. And this could be quite dangerous for him. Other ideas, knight e2, hitting the queen and developing with tempo makes a lot of sense, but feels just a little bit tame after something like queen f6, maybe takes, knight c3, king e7. I don't know, knight e2 actually does look quite attractive, developing with tempo. Bishop b5 check first, bishop d7, something like this, and then knight e2 is also an idea, but I'm a little bit concerned that might actually help him to complete his development. So I'm thinking now knight e2. And I have to be a bit careful of time because, yeah, the game has gotten a bit complex, and yeah, I just have to be careful not to burn too much time on the clock. So something like queen f6 or queen e5, my idea is just to swap off the queens and damage his pawn structure and say to him, well, you will recover this pawn, but you know, I've given back my material advantage, but I've gotten some type of structural advantage. So he goes queen to b4, which again makes a lot of sense here to me. The point is now, if I take, the structure for him won't be quite as compromised as in the other variations. So I think it's a very smart decision from him. Nevertheless, I'm going to take just so that I gain a very nice square d4. And I'm hoping that this pawn will be a little bit more of a vulnerability than an asset. I'm also hoping that maybe under some circumstances, some of these compromised queenside squares might actually help me. And the other thing that I'm hoping for is that this pawn on d5 is quite a nuisance for him, because it does make the e7 pawn a semi-backward pawn here on this semi-open e-file. So I suspect he's probably going to take, but he knows he's not in a rush to capture the pawn on g7. For example, if he considers that bishop b5 check ideas are bothersome, he can invest the tempo in playing a move like a6 here. And I think that's a very reasonable try, actually, to just play the move a6. The only question is, does the check actually bother him or not? And the truth is, I myself am not sure. I'm not sure if that check is something that he needs to take a tempo to stop. But in general, the control of the b5 square obviously is a little bit attractive to him. So he goes like this, which is a little bit surprising. I think he's kind of inviting bishop to b5, so I'm happy to do that, because I think the exchange of the bishops will make the c6 square a little bit more of a problem for him to worry about. So for example, when these guys come off the board, there might be some rook here and knight to c6 ideas, and just in conjunction with pressing against the e7 pawn. I think overall black is quite close to equal here, maybe objectively just equal, but I do think that the white position is a little bit easier to play. And I'm not sure that I love a6, because yeah, he wants to take with the king in order to cover this square. But now the question is, how are you going to actually complete your development of this knight? I mean, I can see a plan involving a6 knight here and knight here. I think that's an interesting possibility, but for now, it does feel maybe a little on the slow side. Black has actually reduced the material very significantly, and yeah, I think overall he's in okay shape. One question after rook takes g7 is if I can actually jump here knight c6. The point being that after this exchange, king takes, we would go rook takes e7, and my double rook endgame there. Again, black may try and hold a draw, but his rook on g7 would be very misplaced. Everything would be quite ugly. So definitely it's something worth investigating here. The question is, what would he do? If he plays e6 or e5, I think I can actually just take the pawn. King takes, e7, yeah. So that seems quite interesting. If he goes here, c7 here. The only thing is, he might actually go, after this, he might just take and go king d8. And then I'm trying to see what I have there, actually. And the answer is I don't see myself having so much there. And my pawn might actually end up a bit in no man's land. So I'm not a huge fan of that. So what I'm thinking to do is some kind of rook move. Let's say rook e3. And my idea is, first of all, I threaten some c3, a3 stuff just to, for example, a3. If I could exchange the a for the b pawn, that should be good for me structurally, because if you notice, I have one pawn chain here and a second pawn chain known as pawn islands, and he has the same. He has one chain here and the other chain here. So we both have two pawn chains, but if I play the move a3 and he exchanges and rook takes, then he's left with an isolated pawn here. So I like that idea in principle. He's gone rook a7. I think the idea is that if rook here, he wants just some king d8 move and to defend the pawn. So clearly, very logical plan. I'm going to go for a3 anyway, and I'm going to just pre-move rook takes a3, as I don't want to take b takes a3 if he does exchange, because then my pawn on a3 is a little bit silly. So he took, I think, because he understood that he was going to get an isolated pawn regardless. If, for example, after a3 he played a5, then pawn takes, this pawn would be isolated, and I guess in his estimation it was going to be even more vulnerable. So he's gone e5. That's a really interesting move. Very committal. He's obviously annoyed by the presence of my knight here. Now my question is, do I ignore it and keep this pawn? So for example, I could even play a move like knight b5. Or do I take, and somehow argue that that doing this helps me? It's a tough decision, but it's one that I have to make pretty soon. I have a feeling that this structure here is going to be very weak for him overall, but I'm not sure that my feeling is correct. But I have a nice tactical shot here, which is knight b5, which was the idea that I saw, funnily enough, in this shape. I was thinking of knight b5, but now I kind of recycled the idea in a very strong context, because now after a takes, rook takes, not only is it an exchange, but this rook on g7 would get skewered. And so instead he has to move his rook, but wherever he moves it, then this pawn on d6 is falling on the next move. And on top of that, I will be up a pawn, but his structure will be very bad. So in fact, it turns out that e5, I think, was just was a big blunder. But the position is a little bit awkward, because you can see his knight is still passive on this square. The rook on a7 is passive, and the rook on g7 is currently passive as well, and black needs to spend time recycling it. Probably a move like rook g8 here, with the intention to put the rook on c8. Something like this would probably have made the most sense. He's gone back, and now the question is, do I take, for example, king here, and then I could potentially go something like rook here, or do I take like this and then do something else, right? So, I mean, I quite like the idea of capturing like this, and then after the king moves, just going rook b6. It feels very, very strong to me. Because if he goes knight d7, I'm going to take here, and that way I'll be up 2 pawns. And so overall, the position is winning in the end. He does resign. Certainly you could play on with a minute against 45 seconds, anything can happen. But I think his position just went a little bit wrong. As you can see, the position is, the engine gives something like +1. I think what actually happened to him is that in this position, actually, funnily enough, I missed some very strong continuations. Remember, I considered moves like g3, I considered moves like bishop b5 as well, but I discarded them, and it turns out that I was wrong to do so, because apparently bishop b5, for some reason I still don't understand, was quite a strong move here. The point is that after something like bishop to b7 or bishop to d7, which is sort of what I was expecting, now we can go some knight move, let's say with tempo on the queen, and then after the queen moves, just drop the bishop back. And I guess that the point that the computer is making is that if you get a position like this, the queen side for black is actually just collapsing after a move like queen b4 here. Queen b7 is just too strong, and if you have to go back here with bishop to c8, then, I mean, okay, the computer gives moves like knight to g5 here, but I suspect even a move like this is going to be a big advantage. Knight g5 is a very nice touch, though, activating that knight before black can go queen f6. And the point is that if black now kicks out the piece, white can actually centralize his knight, and thus creating a lot of big threats. And the other thing that black can do, I mean, the computer is sort of showing off, is rook he1 here. And the point is, if you take here, then queen takes d6 is just a total collapse of the black position. So I mishandled my advantage for sure with d5. I mean, the computer still thinks it's a very, very nice advantage. And I thought really here, after c5, yeah, I considered again the move bishop b5, but I went a little bit wrong with this, queen b4. And I think my mistake where I let go of some of the advantage was to go for this. Maybe I was a bit trigger happy to exchange the queens, but still, as you can see, the engine really likes the position still for white here, even just a move like bishop to c4. Doesn't like the exchange of the bishops, which in hindsight makes sense, because here what I'm realizing now is that if I put the bishop on c4, let's say, and get a position like this, it's going to be extremely awkward for black to develop his knight, because the bishop is interfering, and at the same time the bishop doesn't really have many squares available to it, since white controls most of them on both of the bishop's diagonals. So an interesting game, but overall, okay, full of mistakes, as any chess game between humans is, but certainly as any rapid game. And here black had sort of gotten back into the game, still a little advantage for white, but rook g8 was necessary, correcting his worst placed piece. But e5 is very human move, just trying to break away from, trying to sort of hack, undermine the some of this sort of assets in the white position. But after pawn takes, knight b5 was a little tactic that I was lucky to find at the end. So thank you to my opponent for the game. Definitely a very tough opponent and a tough game.